The Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries opens a much deeper conversation than most people realize, because it speaks differently to the tension between transcendence, material reality, and the future of human consciousness. Saturn and Neptune met on February 20th, 2026, beginning a brand new cycle in Aries, the sign of initiation, emergence, and the raw will to begin at 0 degrees. Now, what interests me about this is that it feels bigger than a transit. It feels like some sort of opening in consciousness, because Aries is not passive. Aries moves, it acts, it brings spirit into motion. So when Saturn and Neptune come together there at the 0 degree point, which is basically the portal of opening of human consciousness, well, I don't see a dream meeting discipline. I see a deeper questioning opening up around how we use will, how we embody vision, and how we stay human while moving through enormous spiritual and material tension. And what this brought was Rudolf Steiner. He came into this conversation. If you've never heard of Rudolf Steiner, you're not alone. I'm still learning too. Steiner was an Austrian-born spiritual thinker and the founder of anthroposophy. And one of the things he spoke about was the way human consciousness can get pulled between Luciferic and Ahrimanic forces, with Christ as a balancing or mediating principle between them. Now, I want to say this carefully because those words can sound very loaded. Steiner was not talking about simple cartoon ideas of good versus evil. He was describing distortions, exaggerations, ways consciousness can tip too far in one direction and lose its center. This is what makes this so relevant to astrology right now. The Luciferic, in Steiner's language, is a pull towards spiritual inflation, seduction through light, and the temptation to move out of earthly reality too quickly. It is transcendence without grounding. It is the part of consciousness that wants to rise above the density of life instead of fully inhabiting it. Steiner's archive material repeatedly frames Luciferic influence as a force that draws the human being away from earthly balance. And that's why Neptune feels so resonant right here in this conversation, because Neptune dissolves boundaries. Neptune opens intuition. Neptune heightens dream, symbol, longing, mastery, compassion, and the invisible currents underneath ordinary life. Neptune reminds us that reality is more than what can be measured, but Neptune also can blur discernment. It can tempt us into fantasy, projection, idealization, and escape, spiritual escape. So when I look at Steiner's Luciferic language, I can see how naturally it maps into Neptune. Not because Neptune is wrong, but because the spiritual impulse can become exaggerated when it loses its relationship to embodiment. And then there's the Ahrimanic. Now, this is the opposite distortion. Not too much spirit, but too much density, too much control, too much identification with form, mechanism, measurable reality, and the hard edges of the material world. Steiner describes Ahrimanic influence as a pull towards hardening and materialism, where consciousness gets trapped in what can be quantified and loses its relationship to spirit. And this is where Saturn comes in, because Saturn gives structure. Saturn gives law, responsibility, time, consequence, and form. Saturn helps us to build. Saturn helps us to make things real. But when Saturn gets exaggerated, it can harden into fear, rigidity, hyper-control, and a life that becomes all scaffolding and no soul. So just as Neptune can describe the risk of over-spiritualization, Saturn can describe the risk of over-materialization. And now both are meeting in Aries. And this is what makes it so potent, because Aries is fire. Aries is initiation. Aries says move. It says choose. It says to become. So when Saturn and Neptune come together there, consciousness is being asked a very direct question. How are you going to use your fire now? Will you use it to drift further into the ideal without grounding it? Or will you use it to harden even further into structure without soul? Or will you find a way to let spirit and matter meet in a more conscious way? And this is where I think the conversation becomes deeply relatable, because people are feeling this without always having the language for it. The tension between staying spiritually connected and staying spiritually present in the world. And this is the part of why astrology feels so relevant to this conversation. Because I even saw a post asking how people balance being a light worker, quote unquote, while still staying present in the physical world. And I thought, yes, that's exactly the question. That is the everyday language version of the same deeper tension. How do I stay connected to spirit without leaving my body? And how do I stay awake without floating away? How do I remain present in matter without becoming hardened by it? That is the live reality underneath this whole conversation. And to me, this is where the rest of the sky becomes so important, because while Saturn and Neptune are showing us the polarity, Mars in Pisces and Jupiter in Cancer offer another way of understanding the center. In March 2026, Mars was in Pisces and Jupiter's in Cancer, which supports the feeling of being the bridge that we're all talking about being. Mars in Pisces does not push the way Mars in Aries pushes. Mars in Pisces moves through feeling and intuition, atmosphere, and inner listening. Jupiter in Cancer expands care, emotional intelligence, memory, nourishment, and the wisdom of the body. So if Saturn and Neptune are showing us the tension between spiritual escape and material hardening, Mars in Pisces trining Jupiter in Cancer, which is a harmonious aspect, it feels like a reminder that the middle path is not found through force. It's found through feeling. That matters to me because I think this is where Steiner's Christ principle becomes really meaningful. Not as dogma and not as religion flattened into rules, but as the mediating center, the balancing force. Steiner's work explicitly presents Christ in relation to Lucifer and Ahriman as a reconciling principle. And he also speaks of a center in the heart from which the balance must be maintained. That, to me, is the middle path, not leaving the world through spirit and not hardening inside the matter, but staying present long enough for a truer form of consciousness to emerge. And that is why I wanted to bring Rudolf Steiner into the astrology, because astrology gives us the timing and the symbolism and the archetypical language. And Steiner right now is giving us another lens for understanding what those archetypes might be revealing inside the human experience itself. So for me, this conjunction is not just rare because of the planets involved. It matters because it brings a real choice point into focus. How am I using my fire? What am I initiating from? Am I acting from illusion? Am I acting from fear? Am I escaping upward? Am I hardening downward? Or am I willing to stay in the center long enough for spirit and structure to come into right relationship? That feels like the invitation of Saturn and Neptune in Aries. Not spirit over matter, not matter over spirit, but the courage to hold both long enough for something more conscious to be born. We've got this, soul fam. So much love.